Can you hear me? Oh, you're on mute.
That's probably because I had it muted.
How's it going?
Yeah, not bad. Not bad. Just going along as one does.
Yeah.
I'm curious how many folks are showing up today. The agenda was pretty light.
I think I just added something in there just for the salsa thing. Let me just make sure. Yes. Oops.
For viewers at home, I apologize for my artfully disheveled appearance. I cut myself earlier in the week, so I'm having to let the skin heal.
Ow.
I'm going to give it a few more minutes for folks to come in before I kick it off. We got a bit of headroom on the agenda, so I think we can wait a little longer. All right, let's get the show on the road. Let me just post the link to the notes in the comments section or the chat section so folks can hop in. If you haven't added your name, please do so. That helps us know who attended and so that we know who's coming and we can talk to them again in the future. The first thing we do in these sessions usually is introductions and new faces. So if you're new and you'd like to introduce yourself, or if you feel like it's been a while since you introduced yourself and everyone's struggling to remember you, please feel free to hop in and pipe up.
So I think I'm new to this group. I'm Mike. I work at Kusari, a supply chain security startup, and I'm also a member of the Salsa steering committee, as well as a CNCF security tag lead.
I'll just hop in and say, Christine, with F5, I lead the OSPO over there. It's been a while since I've been in one of these meetings, so I just wanted to say hello.
Hello. Anyone else feel like introducing themselves? All right, if not, we can carry on. Mike, you have
Jacques, I think you just hit mute in the middle there.
that was clever of me. I'm sometimes accused of being smart, but I don't see it. Mike, you had the first item, which was salsa distribution and discovery.
Sure. So give me 1 second just to pull up. I wrote up a few slides, and I apologize that I am a hands-on keyboard engineer. Making slides is not my strong point here. It's super simple, super straightforward, mostly just a conversation here. But let me just once I kind of figure out how to share my screen on this machine. There we go. Okay. And let me put this in slideshow mode. Okay, cool. So pretty much just sort of reaching out to this group to see if there's interest in participating in or being involved in sort of generalizing or creating a specification for how package metadata like salsa, attestations, Sbombs, et cetera, how they are distributed, and found for folks who are, looking at software repos and Google, whether it's a GitHub release or something from NPM or PyPI, so on. And so let me just kind of go through, the problem today, right, is we have Sbombs, there's now salsa attestation documents, there's all sorts of new interesting metadata documents that people are developing, like there's now S2C2F that's coming up, and there's a bunch of other things that are coming up. And right now, there's really no standardized way around for folks to sort of distribute those documents, especially when looking at some of the packaging ecosystems. So, for example, we have NPM looking at generating a API for distributing things like Sbombs, salsa attestations, and so on. But so is PyPI. And as far as I know, they're not necessarily really communicating together. And obviously that could lead to issues like, the tools that, let's say, would consume these salsa attestations, these Sbombs, these other metadata documents might need to support multiple different ecosystems when in some cases we might be able to have something similar to, like, let's say OCI, or even take some of what OCI has done in similar sorts of specifications, and just sort of say, hey, as long as you support this, as long as you support this, you can easily ingest metadata documents coming from anything that supports that API, right? And then also in addition to that, some various other ecosystems, I believe Brew was one of them, Homebrew, has expressed a sort of desire to say, hey, we don't want to be involved in generating the specification or generating our own API for this. We would much rather if somebody else sort of said, here's what you do. You just need to either implement it, or you could just use these libraries and this like API thing, and you just sort of get that. Cool. So that's the general problem here. And then to kind of give a little bit more of a background on some of this, right? So salsa, and I know salsa had given a little bit of a presentation either last week or the week before. So salsa is a security framework for securing artifacts from supply chain attacks. It does this through a set of requirements, mostly focused on the build right now. I'm mostly focused on providing provenance of artifacts so that that this code led to this output. And so it's two things. It's that set of requirements as well as a metadata document format, referred to as it's the provenance in toto predicate. And for folks who aren't super familiar with in toto is a bunch of different things. In this context, in toto is another metadata format where somebody can say, this is a signed document. So it's somebody making a claim about a thing. And the types of those claims are referred to as predicates in this format. So in this case, it's JSON, and I'll show what that looks like in a second. There's also, in addition to this, right, there's multiple Sbomb formats, like you have your Cyclone DX, you have your SPDX, and so on. There are already some ecosystems like OCI that do have a specification for how to sort of distribute these sorts of documents. They have what's referred to as the distribution spec, and it's a way for them to sort of say inside of a manifest, that's inside your OCI, usually an image, but it could be whatever. But inside your OCI image, you could have a manifest that sort of refers to other documents that are also part of that, things that are associated with that, and it can get loaded in as, you know, a tarball or whatever. And so, but you know that, you know, if I look at the manifest, I know what documents are associated usually with that container image. So if I have, you know, 2 Sbombs from different places, and I have a salsa attestation, that can all live in the manifest, and you know what it points to in there. And then the other thing that's kind of pretty common about all of these documents that we're talking about, like your Sbombs, your salsa attestations, and so on, is the documents are associated with an artifact or package, usually by the hash, so usually by the checksum of that package. So in the case of salsa, and I'll show this in a second, there's something like, you know, you have like the output artifact, and that output artifact is usually has, like, you know, the name of the output artifact plus the hash. And so that, you know, if somebody is going and saying like, hey, I want to say if this salsa attestation applies to a certain artifact, you can go and check the hash of that artifact, check the hash that's cited in the signed salsa document. And if those 2 things lined up, you know that, hey, whoever signed this document, and yes, it does refer to this specific artifact. And in certain cases, especially, this is especially true with Sbombs, it's sometimes in the cases where either the checksum isn't known, or in certain cases where the checksum doesn't necessarily really indicate what it actually is, because it's a set of different things all structured in a certain way. Sometimes folks use package URLs or other things that at least they're trying to be unique identifiers of packages. And so that means that, you know, you can easily, the goal here being that, you know, you should be able to say, hey, I have a hash, or I have some sort of unique way of stating here's a package or an artifact, and I want to know all the documents that are associated with that, let's say for an ecosystem that I'm downloading from. So, and let me show you some examples here real quick. And this is just the salsa provenance document format. So just so you have an idea of what generally we're trying to do here is, if I go over to, something like this, you can see, you know, there's some extra stuff, doesn't really matter right now, but the main thing is you have the subject, which this is sort of the output that we're referring to. So this could be a Python package, this could be an npm package, this could be I don't know, you know, just a tarball or whatever. And there is, you know, a hash associated with that. So you can imagine in many cases, like this is, let's say, the digest of an image or something like that. And so when folks are looking for that, they sort of download this document. It's usually signed. They can verify that signature, and then they can look at all the stuff that's in here that's, you know, provide some additional metadata, mostly related to the build for salsa. But you can imagine this, you know, there's going to be lots of different document formats that are going to look similar to this. That could be, you know, Sbombs, and so list of files and dependencies that went into a thing. It could be a security scan. It could be a lot of these other things. And with the growing sort of desire for a lot of ecosystems to start approaching the problem of how do we tell folks who are consuming these things that, yes, this was actually built by the maintainer of the package, and not somebody had stolen the maintainer of the package password and, you know, published a package, you know, and that sort of thing. Not like that's ever happened before, right? Of course. But, you know, like these sorts of things are growing increasingly common, and folks are now saying, hey, we want to be able to have some metadata that can only be associated with like the maintainer of the package, the creator of the package. And for certain folks, they want to know, like, hey, does this thing use, you know, a compromised version of Log4j? I want to have the Sbomb, but how do I know if that package even has an Sbomb? And so that's kind of where a lot of this desire comes in, is how do we both distribute it for ecosystems and so on, like whether it's, hey, I'm downloading something from, you know, JFrog Artifactory or a Sonatype Nexus, or I'm pulling something down from PyPI or NPM and that sort of thing. So if I go back here. And so, you know, the ask here is just to kind of actually tie it back a little bit more to the goals again, end users for two reasons. You know, end users from the perspective of somebody who's actually using the, actually, let me take a step back. So there's two main users of what we're looking at here is there are folks who are building tools, right? So this could be the pip developers for Python. This could be Gem for Ruby. This could be, you know, NPM, Yarn, etc. for Node and JavaScript related things. And so developers are saying the end users, right? People who are consuming these packages want to know, are there Sbombs associated with this package and where do I go find them, right? And so, for example, NPM is looking at developing, they've been developing an API that allows, let's say, end users to be able to, while downloading a package, download associated Sbombs and salsa attestations. So it would still, when, you know, a developer publishes a package, they would also publish, you know, anything like an Sbomb, signed salsa attestations and so on. And then for the end user who's then downloading it, can download it either when they actually go to install the app, or in many cases for folks who are like, hey, I don't want to install it if it doesn't have a salsa attestation that meets my requirements. Check, does this package have a salsa attestation before I download it? And then download the salsa attestation first, run, you know, some logic, policy, whatever. It matches, cool, let me download that. So anyway, the ask here is, you know, wanted to gauge interest with this group and also going to probably be reaching out to a few other groups within the OpenSSF and just generally in the open source community, but wanted to see, you know, if there was any interest on defining a simple specification. I don't think we want to kind of have 12 million different features, probably some simple, if I give you a unique identifier that refers to a package, something like a hash, can you give me Sbombs and whatever metadata is associated with it? And then in addition to that, maybe some basic search functionality. So if somebody said, hey, I want to find all Sbombs associated with all versions of this package, because I want to be able to see the differences between them. Things like that, I think, are some basic stuff. But I don't think folks are going to want to have stuff that goes super complicated. But that's one big piece. And then separately, while that sort of specification is being built, I think some folks had been talking about, are there things we can do in the meantime while that sort of specification and any actual implementations are being built out? Are there things we can do to make that distribution a little simpler to help drive adoption until sort of something that's a bit more rigorous is built there? All right, that's my spiel. Any
it's a great
questions,
spiel.
thoughts?
I can only speak with a Ruby Gems hat on. Unfortunately, today we didn't have a great deal of turnout for your presentation, which I hope you won't take personally. I just think that
it's okay.
the planets aligned thus. I guess my question is the proposal here for document format standards, or is it for an API standard? Like what are you emphasizing here? I wanted to understand.
So the thing I'm emphasizing here is more from, like, you can imagine something like, I want a REST API spec, right? That somebody can, let's say, hit this endpoint and so on and so forth. And so that folks who are, let's say, building like a gem, like an update to gems, and somebody can then say in the future, you know, gem might have a flag that says, you know, download the Sbomb first, or run it through some policy or whatever before I actually download the rest. And so this is the same thing goes with like pip and NPM. There's some stuff here about like, hey, if this does not have a salsa attestation, I want to error out, right? I don't want to be able to download this package, right? And I think the thing that folks are starting to ask for is, right? So lots of people are starting to distribute these metadata document types in lots of different ways. Different package ecosystems, some folks are just sort of saying, hey, we just have a bunch of hashes and you just kind of look up the hash dot JSON L for JSON lines or whatever, or something .spdx, and that's how we look up Sbombs or whatever. Some folks are looking at, oh, you have to, there's some complicated API that you hit. Some folks are actually saying, well, no, we just package up any Sbombs and associated metadata in, like, let's say the tarball or whatever that we distribute out to end users. And obviously all these things have different pros and cons. But I think one of the biggest issues is folks have started to express, like, hey, if I'm somebody who's, let's say, building a tool to help out here, right? Whether it is the pip or whether it's some separate tool to say, hey, I want to do some security analysis or whatever. If everybody has a different API and a different way of handling that metadata, those metadata documents, then it gets quite complicated. So that's kind of where I think the push is the push here is for, it doesn't have to be everybody have to do exactly the same thing, of course. It's just more of like, if there are some general practices so that if folks sort of look at this, you can imagine, great, the implementation for publishing and ingesting salsa and Sbombs, et cetera, from npm is very similar to how it works in Ruby and very similar to how it works in PyPI and so on, would I think be valuable to a lot of folks.
I can give some more color on the gem side. One of the principles of Ruby gems is that they do not edit the gem file that's received. It's identical from the upload. So for example, you couldn't crack it open and inject an SBOM or inject a salsa attestation or anything like that. They'd have to be side by side. And the other thing I would note is that whatever design came about would have to be as CDN friendly as possible.
Yes.
Simply because, like, rubygems.org, the application server does a few thousand requests per second at peak, I think. But like the CDN in front of it, Fastly, is doing like millions and millions per minute. And Ruby gems is not that big a deal in terms of like traffic. PyPI also use Fastly, and I imagine that they would be in a similar boat of wanting to be as CDN friendly as possible.
Yeah, and at some point, I think it's probably worthwhile to also bring in some of the NPM folks, because I think they maybe have a bit more of the extreme one.
Right, yeah, there's a lot of things that rhyme. I'm going to suggest, actually, I know this is annoying, but I'm going to suggest that you make another appearance at the next call,
sure,
February 9th. Just that EMEA friendly tends to catch a few more people. Definitely, I usually see NPM folks there, so it is an unusually light turnout today.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, and just wanted to get feedback, start sort of bringing up some of this stuff, because this was something that was brought up in the salsa tooling meeting recently, which was people are starting to publish their stuff to, let's say GitHub, right? But even among GitHub releases, nobody really has a pattern for like, well, where should this salsa actually live? Should it live under like this piece of releases? Should it just be a flat file? Should I, and then, folks I think are going to be asking for, some basic functionality here and there, just so that, as they download, for example, something like it, whether it's a Ruby gem or whatever, they want to know, like, it doesn't have to literally live inside the same package. It could just sort of say, when I download this thing, I can also make a separate request here to pull down this item, and then when I download the package, I can compare the hashes, whatever. Like, I think it's just right now a lot of interest in sort of trying to figure out some of those things before everybody starts distributing, starts generating salsa attestations and Sbombs everywhere, because then as soon as they do, people are going to say, great, just as an example, like npm uses this API, that the REST API, this other one uses this, a SOAP API or whatever. Everybody's starting to use very different things, very different nouns and verbs. And then before you know it, like, okay, great, I'm somebody who is, maintaining something that interacts with both Ruby, both Ruby and Python, but I need to now implement completely different things for those two ecosystems, as opposed to, oh, generally they're following this specification. So as long as I follow that specification, I know I could at least get this baseline level of thing.
Mhm. Would anyone else like to chime in?
I have one minor question. So one thing I didn't understand, the API will give us access to salsa attestation or Sbombs documentation. So I was wondering, do we have any source that where maintainers are generating those Sbombs, or they have those Sbombs and they will share it with that API, or is it something just to have the API now, then once we will have large population generating Sbombs or salsa attestation, then it will be useful? What's the
Yeah, so I think we're hitting a point where people want to generate salsa attestations and they don't know what's the best practice. And so we're seeing a lot of folks generating salsa attestations, but not publishing those salsa attestations to something that could be consumed consistently. So you can imagine like, oh, I include the salsa attestation on, just as an example here, oh, I include the salsa attestation in my GitHub release. Somebody else might say, hey, no, I include this salsa attestation in this REST API if you need to hit it. And for the end user, they might say, well, great, there's a lot of packaging ecosystems out there. Is there something that I could just use that's consistent to be able to download that? And so that so that's one thing. And so to go back a little bit more, as salsa is about to hit 1.0 and Sbombs are growing in sort of popularity, a lot of folks are asking like, hey, I'm generating these Sbombs. Where do they go? And then separately, the people who are like, oh, great, how should they be consumed is also, I think those two things are very closely tied. And so it is sort of a chicken and egg thing where we think that people are generating Sbombs, but they're, a lot of folks who are generating Sbombs are just saying like on demand, we'll give you an Sbomb. But in addition to that, a lot of folks who are generating Sbombs just have no place to put them. And then separately, there's the other problem of, hey, there's a lot of folks who want to consume Sbombs, but they just don't know where to look. And so we're hoping this sort of thing can help out there, especially if there is, something like a consistent generic API for some of this stuff. Like OCI, for example, does a pretty good job with their new distribution spec and some of the other things that they've done recently, where they sort of defined, hey, you could just include things in a manifest and you can download those things, and they have types associated with them. So you might have something like, just as an example, they're MIME types, but you could just imagine like metadata / SPDX, metadata / salsa or whatever. And then, oh, cool, I know that there's salsa attestations associated with this thing. Great, I can download that salsa attestation. So I think that's generally the thing. There is folks are starting to use these things, but because there's no standards and practices, we're potentially at a point where like a lot of people are just gonna be like, it doesn't pay for me to even make this thing if there's no way to consume it. And there's going to be a lot of folks who are saying, hey, if I can't consume an Sbomb, how could I possibly, why should I produce one myself? That sort of thing.
That'd be interesting if we can have a common platform where we can get this kind of data. One thing, very recently, we wrote a paper on Sbomb advantage and disadvantage, like how practitioners are thinking about Sbomb. One thing that we noticed that the first difficulties with Sbomb was lack of data standardization or interoperable subjects between different formats. And then another thing that came, which was not very popular among the practitioners' perspective, that they don't want to share sensitive information unless it is demanded by or any NDA was given, that it won't be shared to their competitors or stuff like that. So yeah, and one thing that we could not verify from that study, that practitioners have shared their opinion, but we could not find any resources where we can actually look into those data. Like they claim about false positive, data interoperability issues, but we didn't have any resources to look into such data. And I think I haven't worked with salsa, but we may have similar issues. That's something. It will be a good thing if we have that.
Yeah, and so I think that thing that you bring up, so yeah, like there's right now, I think what I'm bringing up here is more focused on the open source world, where hopefully folks are not going to be as cautious with that sort of stuff. I recognize, for certain businesses, they're like, hey, we don't want to give away our secret sauce, and we believe what dependencies we use to be part of that. I don't necessarily agree, but I understand at least where that argument's coming from. And I think to that point, actually, is, yeah, so there are a couple of other things that are related, right? Very few tools actually follow the SPDX or Sbombs specs. Like a lot of them, they follow a lot of it, but they actually, because of sometimes it's just as simple as a typo calling this key a different key name, and now all of a sudden everything you're generating isn't actually valid to the spec. Yeah, we're definitely noticing a lot of that. And part of this is part of that, like standardization effort. Yeah, I'm not super involved in the Sbombs stuff outside of more as a consumer, but I know from the salsa end, we're trying to, if we can, maybe even have stuff like a salsa publishing library. So here's a library for generating and publishing salsa documents. But if we were to publish those salsa documents, we want to make sure that let's say, let's just say for now, it's going to be a Go library or whatever, but we want to make sure that that Go library supports as many publishing to as many ecosystems as is possible. So we don't end up having to do, and also consuming from as many ecosystems as possible. So we don't have to go in and have a separate implementation for both publishing and consuming salsa metadata for, Ruby gems, as we do for NPM and so on and so forth. Like, because that sort of thing will, having all those different implementations can end up, also making it very difficult then for those things to remain consistent, to make them remain relatively bug-free, to have sort of a consistent experience across the ecosystems.
And on that point, it would be nice to have, if not a shared tool, then at least a shared corpus of valid and invalid examples. There is, in my experience, nothing harder in the world to convince somebody to use a tool from another ecosystem. And very often for good reason, right? Like shelling out to something is kind of not, it's a bit black boxy, right? It kind of interrupts the thing, and it also means, you've got to deal with the business of distributing that item with the rest of the software and blah, blah, blah. So
yeah, that's definitely something we agree with. I think we're trying to keep it as simple as possible, and potentially also as non-impactful as possible. Like the thing, I don't want to go too deep into the implementation weeds, but some of the things that people have brought up is it might just make sense to have a separate REST API, just have a specification for that REST API. And so, yes, you make two separate requests, one request to actually download the package, one request to download metadata associated with that package to a separate REST API, but then it doesn't necessarily really, like, you could still download the package. You don't actually, you're not required to have the backend now support all this extra stuff, depending on whether or not you want to integrate that API inside the rest of it. But like, we're trying to keep it, I think we do want to try and keep it simple. And it is, in addition to that, I think, the big thing here is we do want to keep it, and I highlighted simple, is we don't want to end up with a thing with like 12,000 features and like, yeah, somebody should be able to come in and just say, does this have a vulnerability? And have it automatically go out to the API and ask Ruby gems for canonical information and whatever.
Yeah,
right?
They're not going to do that.
Yeah, exactly. We just want to say, hey, based on this hash or based on this name of a thing, are there metadata documents associated with it that are whatever, and can I download those metadata documents? I think that's really that's the gist of it.
I think it still ties to that point I made earlier, which is that like anything that adds to the API burden is going to be viewed unfavorably, versus something that can rely on the presence or absence of a file at a predictable URL.
Yeah, I think that's probably fine. I think, and by REST API, I could just mean like literally an endpoint called / metadata / and then like some consistent naming scheme for those files.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just goes back to that point of wanting to have CDN friendliness as a design constraint.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm not by myself now. I see Joseph has joined. Hi, Joseph. And Joseph, just for context, we're talking about sort of the question of how Sbombs and salsa attestations can be distributed for package ecosystems. And I was making the case that something that's sort of like an API-based approach imposes sort of a fair amount of potential load on the application server versus something where it's like basically it's a path that can be served directly by the CDN, where we can let Fastly worry about it. And that was generally what we were discussing just at the last few seconds. I'll say again, it would be good to represent this at the February 9 meeting, just because we've got the thin turnout today. I can see that basically only those of us from Ruby Gems have showed up, to my knowledge. Oh, that's not true. Randall's here. Hi, Randall. Sorry. Didn't mean to overlook you.
It's all good.
I mean, Homebrew uses Ruby, so.
I can't there's actually a situation going on with Homebrew and OpenSSF involvement, so I can't speak much of Homebrew at the moment.
Your secret is safe with us.
Yeah.
But let me say this, Michael, just from what I can say and what's kind of going on. I think that you do have to treat all of these things with the utmost care, because certain, shall we say, people in Homebrew treat open source like religion. So when you start talking about security and implementing, things that, should be done and are for the greater good, there's always someone on the other side of the fence that, let me just say this, the word strong-armed was used a lot recently.
Yeah. Yes. I don't know who, but I definitely know that folks from all the ecosystems. And in fact, actually, I can't remember who it was from Homebrew, if it was yourself or somebody else who had said, hey, if something like this were to kind of get done, I know that it sounded like Homebrew wanted to be more of a consumer of the thing. They were like, look, if other folks build a thing, we were totally down
to be honest, to actually tell you where Homebrew's position on this would be is like, look, if you want to come at them with money or like with the work or something along those lines, they might be willing to do it. There would be a big maintainer burden. What if? Because that's kind of what apparently it's all about nowadays.
Yeah.
Is maintainer burden this, maintainer burden that. But yeah, like they're very much, they would be like, do we really need this? And yeah, it's a whole thing. In all honesty, I don't know if Homebrew is a good ecosystem to talk about security, because they would prefer to rely on their license that basically, according to them, excludes them from all security responsibility.
Yeah, let's see what the quotes say. I don't think that's going to hold. And we're getting off topic, but I'll have this little rant. One of these days, a major US city is going to lose power or water for a few days, and Congress is going to flip the table. They're not going to sit around and go like, let's discuss this carefully for a few months and take soundings and really understand open source software and make sure that we come to a meeting of the minds. They're just going to flip the table and regulate the shit out of everything. And they're just going to like turn those licenses into, toothpaste because they can, right? Copyright is an instrument of Congress.
if I can add to that, Jock, that I kind of presented somewhat of a similar point during our discussions this week. And somebody decided, we're not going to point fingers, but let's just say that somebody in the room decided to start trolling, going, well, that's not my government. And I was like, this is just not a productive conversation.
You don't have to believe in the government for it to be the government. That's a well-established principle of statecraft, I'm afraid.
You know, when all this was happening, I went to Crow because Crow's kind of my resource. And I was like, I have a fire burning. It's about to get under control. What do you want me to do? And he was like, yeah.
Sure. This is a topic that has come up in every ecosystem so far that has rolled out a public health measure or a public safety measure, I guess a better way to put it. We've seen it in Ruby Gems. It happened for PyPI. It happened for NPM. It will happen everywhere for everyone. My only regret in working in this space is that there isn't a way to designate myself as the lightning rod, because I do not give a shit how mad people get at me. It's necessary.
Yeah, that's likewise. I will say this, though, that I think it might be important for us to differentiate like what you would consider like end user package distribution type scenarios like Homebrew and Portage from Gentoo and PyPI, and because I think that the mentality of the person that is using it is different. Because I know like at Homebrew, for example, like despite everything that they say, if we distribute like, and we've done it in the past, I forget which one it was. I think I want to say it was Audacity when they started bundling like spyware into their thing, or I could be wrong, but it was one of those music editing programs, and we removed it because it had, bad stuff in it. And then it was like a bunch of people got pissed off of that. We put it back in, and a bunch of people got pissed off about that too. So yeah, and it was one of those things that Homebrew maintains, that we are not a security system. Do not take us as like a security defense, because we're not, and we'll like, disavow all knowledge, all responsibility. But yeah, I think that that's also important maybe though to distinguish, because it is true, like there are different mentalities when you're dealing with developers and people that download things, and hey, it should work and it should be relatively safe, because if not, they wouldn't carry it. They're not that bad.
Yeah, as I said, so I studied law for a few years, and I can tell you that torts is a mind twister. But the way the courts can find to pin something to you that you did everything in your power to lay off, right? You wrote contracts, you got agreements, you created trusts, you have corporations and LLCs and all that jazz, and somehow the court's just like, nah, you are responsible. I would be more nervous in that position.
And I think that technical definition is anyone that distributes software, as far as like, I know we're talking about US executive orders, but I think we are in that vendor chain of like vendoring software, even though it's not our software. So yeah.
It's something I wanted to raise, but I guess I'll raise next time because I have another talking point here that we should get to before we finish. One thing I should raise next time is the Cyber Resilience Act that's been mooted or discussed in the EU. On an uncharitable reading, it could apply to package ecosystems. While in the citations, like the prelude, where the whereas this, whereas that, they're like, oh, we don't want to cover open source. But then in the actual legislation, the actual legally binding parts of it, open source doesn't get mentioned at all. They define, a distributor of a software product. And if you look at it and you don't have to squint very hard, you're like, that sounds like Ruby Gems and Maven and PyPI and NPM and all of us. So I want to raise that at a later time. Okay, speaking of going to the next item, I wanted to quickly report back on a meeting that happened yesterday, in fact, and Nusrat was there. I think Joseph was there as well. We had a meeting which was organized by John Meadows from the End Users Working Group. The subject was a topic that's come up here a few times, which is the need or the want for a collection, like a central collection point, partly for useful basic metadata on packages, but also and especially a controlled corpus of malware samples. At the moment, when something is reported to a package ecosystem, they yank it, it gets deleted, and there's no sample available for study by qualified and identified researchers. So the main thing that sort of came out of that, I would say, actually, I kept notes on it, which I'm going to pull up on my screen over here. They're sort of notes mostly for internal consumption, so I can't share my screen, unfortunately, because then I'd be sort of showing off all this other stuff that we're doing that's private. Give me a second to find it, but I can use it to refresh my memory. Yes, so there was obvious consensus that such a thing is necessary. There was recognition that the repos have limited developer bandwidth, or maintainer burden is an issue, as you were putting it, Randall. So a big thing that the OpenSSF can do is to bring money to the table, either to offer contracts or grants to subsidize the work, and that we should try to start small rather than sort of planning to do everything, because there's a lot of things that spin off from the original idea that are possibilities. We could do this, and we could tie it into threat intelligence and analyze trends and spot attacks as they happen and report them to people, all this kind of stuff. Awesome. A hell of a lot of work. So we want to try and start with a very simple thing of like, what is the smallest amount of data that we can send to a central point? And what is the simplest way to create a central point to send malware samples to? So John, I believe, has the ball at the moment in terms of what happens next. I'm hopeful basically that we write a proposal and send it up to TAC to send a governing board for some money to, as I said, do a grant or a contract. Does that square with what you remember, Joseph or Nusrat?
Yeah. Yes. So I have started writing a document with Jack, recording what type of data we might want from different ecosystem, including malicious package. It is still work in progress, but we have started that part, and probably whenever Jack is there, probably he will share more information.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah, that's great. I didn't have anything else on the agenda. Was there any other business that folks wanted to bring up or discuss today while we were all here? Yes, it really happened. Okay, well, there being no other business tonight, what I'm going to do is let folks leave early and get their evenings back for those of us who are not in APAC times, and to get some morning time back for those who are. Thanks everybody for coming. Our next meeting is on February 9th. That will be the EMEA friendly time. So if you're in APAC, a bit rough, but for those of us in the United States or Europe, probably a little easier. Until then, it's been wonderful, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.